Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you about fires and fire management. Can I say how happy I am to be talking to a room full of young men who are properly dressed. It's very nice to see. And of course, ladies are always properly dressed. What we'll be doing today is just checking through 4 or 5 things that I think are really important for you to appreciate. My understanding is that you were lucky enough to spend some time with Marc Castellano in Barcelona. Marc is a very experienced fire manager, fire suppression manager, firefighter, and you would have heard from him some of his ideas and the distillation of his thinking around what's happened. What you'll see here is some more distillation of thinking, but at a different level. So it complements what Marc would have told you. And I urge you to keep thinking about what Marc would have said. So some fire causes, a bit about numbers and areas, the limitations of suppression. Number 3 is really important. If you come away from this discussion with nothing else in your minds, I would like you to understand that particular point. A little bit about what we do in FAO and then some reflection on fires in India. I won't be talking about the cricket. It's very important to understand that globally, 90% of fires are caused by people. This doesn't mean arson, it means accidents, misunderstandings, misadventure, poor practice, and so on. It's not arson. In Europe, that's 95%. In places like Canada, it's 50%. Remembering that Canada, the northern 2/3 of Canada is basically uninhabited. They're human caused, but their effects are basically because of and amongst. We have fuel conditions, so things that burn. We have fuel availability, the fuel can burn, and then we have vegetation structures, so areas that where the fuel is, it can burn and it's available to burn. Fire causes, people talk about it all the time, but it's worth thinking about it with 3 parts. The first is the source of ignition. It was a match, it was an accident with machinery, it was something like that. The second is the agency. So it was a train that's brakes froze on, or it was a person. And then the third is the motivation. Were they trying to clear a crop that they just harvested? Were they getting rid of residues? Were they children playing with matches? Whatever it was. If we don't understand why people do things, it's very, very difficult to make any headway about fire management. What about some examples of what's happened in the European Union, where you are now? In the last 17 years, 611 people have been killed, 8.5 million hectares have been burnt, and 54 billion euros in costs and losses. Now remember, this is Western Europe, so this is highly organised governance structures, highly organised institutions and arrangements, lots of infrastructure, roads, rail, communications, water transport, all those things, and it still has happened to this extent. Where I come from, in Australia, we have between 31 million and 72 million hectares per year that is burnt, but we're a very, very large country, and most of that is burnt in places where it doesn't really affect the population or the infrastructure. Here in Italy, where you are, the long-term average is 107,000 hectares a year. Now that's a very different number to Australia, but Italy is only 30 million hectares in size. So in fact, 107,000 hectares in Italy has more effect and causes more damage and is more of a problem than 71 million hectares is in Australia, on the average. Obviously, all places have bad fires. In India, your top 20 districts have about nearly 11,000 fires per year, and you burn, or they burn, about 184,000 hectares per year. Again, India is a very large country, so it depends where those fires are and what effects they're having as to whether they're important or critical or need to be considered, or whether they just need to be monitored. In 2014, there was nearly 5 million hectares burnt in India. That's a significant amount of land in anybody's context. The limits of suppression. 3% of fires in Canada get above 200 hectares. You're all foresters, you've worked in forest, you know that 200 hectares is a reasonable amount of land, but it's not huge. Those 3% cause 97% of the burnt area in Canada. So a very small number of fires get more than 200 hectares, but those fires, 3 out of 100, cause 97% of the area burnt. So they're the fires. You need to understand this sort of imbalance, this dynamic. Similar figures in most countries. Most countries in the world come out at about 90% of the area burnt is burnt by 5 to 10% of the fires that start. There's some good news in that, because that means that the other 90% of fires are probably either not getting large or being managed. So there's skills and capacity that are being applied in all countries that make sure that fires don't get beyond where people want them to be or don't exceed the capacity. Here's a critical point, 2 numbers, 4,000 and 10,000. 4,000 kilowatts a metre is the limit of suppression of direct attack by any form of firefighting. That's 4 or 5 of you with a tank and a truck, 3,000 litres of water, 4,000 kilowatts per metre. Indirect attack, where you work at the back and the sides of the fire, 10,000 kilowatts per metre. What does that look like? 4,000 kilowatts a metre is about the same height as Jaco, he's taller than I am, and it would be burning in 10 tonnes of fine fuel, which is about 3 centimetres of fine fuel, grass or something. A fire like that would be moving at about 2 to 3 kilometres an hour. This doesn't sound very frightening because it isn't very frightening, but it is the limit of suppression. You can't directly put a fire out if it has 4,000 kilowatts a metre or more. 10,000 kilowatts a metre is stronger, obviously. The fire in Portugal in 2017, some of you would perhaps have heard of it or heard it mentioned, certainly Eduardo would know of it. That fire burnt at 20,000 to 60,000 kilowatts per metre. So 5 to 15 times the limit of suppression. So these fires that get away, these big fires, there is nothing we can do about them, and Mark probably made that point as well, I'm sure. Okay, what does that mean in terms of things? What it means is that this, which is a very large aeroplane that carries about 10,000 litres of water, is exactly the same amount of effectiveness as this. A group of people with a piece of machinery and a truck. So the aeroplane is about $25 million. The truck and a bulldozer and 10 men is probably not quite that much money. So when you're planning and looking at what to do and how to do it, think very carefully about where your investment goes and what is useful. What does FAO do? We have, as you've probably heard yesterday and today, a role in supporting countries. So under the guidance of the division, you met the Assistant Director General just a few minutes ago, we strengthen country capacities from the bottom up. FAO has regions, we have about 130 country officers. So we have people in countries that understand the country, understand the context, and can help us work more effectively and more quickly with countries that are interested in particular issues, genetic resources, water and mountains, or fire management. What are we focused on? Obviously, if you're FAO, you're not going to be training firefighters on the ground. There's only one of me, and there's many, many people that need training. We're not going to be doing research, because there are many research institutions that are very capable and very good at that, and we only have a small capacity. What we are going to be doing is looking at improved use of data. You would have seen in perhaps Ansie's talk and heard mentioned by Julian Fox that remote sensing is a source of data, but it needs to be interpreted and it needs to be made available. And so we're working on fire data being available to countries, perhaps not so much India, but other countries that don't have any real idea about where their fires are, how many fires they have, how big those fires are, what time of year they take place. We're also supporting the refinement of the methodology on estimating emissions. It makes sense. Fires burn, smoke goes up, so the products of the combustion are part of the atmospheric gases. Some of those products are very important for greenhouse gas accounting and estimation and for climate change reporting and recording. So we're working with countries and scientists and so on to develop a platform to enable countries to do that more accurately. How do we think about fire management? And this is where Mark would have been talking to you about sort of from the bottom to the middle of the process, and I'm talking to you about the whole process. The first step is that you need to understand your fires. So you need to review and analyse what the situation is. In India, I'll talk about it a little bit in a minute, but in various countries, Armenia, Sudan, wherever. And that includes reviewing and analysing in countries like the United States or Canada or Australia or South Africa or Western Europe. Things are changing. Things are moving. We're getting more data and additional data. We need to keep rethinking things through. With that review, you can then work out what sort of risk reduction you can do. I mentioned before 90% of fires are caused by humans. Obviously, there's a big amount of reducing risk you can do by teaching humans, working with people, local communities about the way they use fire, ignitions and so on. There will always be some fires that escape, and so we need to be ready to fight them. And this is where you have, you know, the training of people, the application of equipment, infrastructure, roads and so on. And then response, going to fight the fire. This is the bit that you always see on the media. The news always covers the firefighting, nearly always with an aeroplane and always with coloured water, more or less. And after that, they show you a house or a building that's been burnt. This is the response thing. You can see from this list that it's one step in 5 steps, and yet the one you see most of the time is this step. Please remember the other 4 steps. They're critical and much more critical than this step. I had a friend in Thailand who was the head of fire management for the Royal Forestry Department who used to tell all trainees that if you're fighting a fire, there is no shame. It is shameful to fight a fire because it means that something's gone wrong. And it's a very good way of thinking about it. What this needs is resources for collecting fire and analysing things, and of course recovering afterwards. Okay, so India. This is the fire danger rating map for India from the Global Wildfire Information System. This is a beta site, so don't take this particularly seriously. It's remote sensing based. This is from yesterday. So I have no knowledge of India particularly, but you can have a look and it'll tell you the darker areas are the ones with a higher fire danger, and the green areas, of which there are not many, in fact not any, are areas of lower fire danger. Some context for India from various reports of the past. Fires are part of your landscape as they are part of the landscapes of many, many countries. Population pressures and other pressures have seen what might have been a relatively stable cycle start to cycle out of balance. Economic losses for India, $164 million per year. That's timber values only. So other values, whether they're catchment values, ecological values, other assets of interest, are not included in that figure. You have a national action plan and you have a nationally determined contribution, which is a commitment to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and those commitments include forest expansion of 5 million hectares in total and an improvement of existing forest of 5 million hectares and additional sinks of 2.5 to 3 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. If you don't deal with the fires, this is not feasible or possible. So fire management is essential. But you're very lucky. Last year, in June of 2018, a joint study which was conducted by the World Bank and by the Ministry of Environment in India released a report. It's a really good report. It's very readily available on the internet. I'd suggest if you have some time, or even if you don't have some time, make some time and just have a look through it. It's a very clear and steady setting out. Being a government and World Bank report, of course, it's relatively large, but it's not terribly large. So what do they propose, amongst other things? some guidelines for forest fire prevention and management and standard operating procedures. Adequate funding and field staffing. You'll be very happy to hear that, as we all should be. Coordination mechanisms. Development and deployment of a fire danger rating system. I showed you the global one, but that's not done by India. It's a remote thing that's done under the aegis of the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. National policy or action plan. Incentivising communities. I mentioned 90% of fires caused by people. We need to work with people at the local level. Sharing knowledge between states and National Forest Fire Information Database. I make the point that I could say this thing about any country I have visited in the role that I'm in, even my own. So don't feel uncertain or unsure about this. These are very common issues that all countries are struggling and dealing with. In your country, almost every solution exists already. There's one part of the country that's worked out fire danger rating, there's another part of the country that's got a good fire reporting system, another part of the country that's working well with communities. It's a matter of moving it around and connecting it together. You will have your solutions already in your country, so go and look for them. So hurry back to India and get to work. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, but of course not about the cricket.
Thank you, Peter. Any issues from your side? Okay, I think it was very complimentary to this Tuesday in Solsona with Mark. And I think it's also important, we commented before, the issue of sociology, as only in very low populated area, thunderstorms are the main cause, and volcanism is a very marginal one. In the settled areas, in the countries where you have people in the countryside, it's a strong, infrequently a sociological issue, and you have to tackle it from that perspective as well. And regarding the damages, it's very typical. Also, Spain did it over a long time, that basically the losses, the differential cost of the wood one burn is calculated, but you should, even before entering environmental services, you should also calculate the gap of revenue during at least 40, 50 years if you don't have intensive plantations. They need to plant, or at least to tend, or both. So investment and less income and the devaluation of wood, these three elements are crucial as private elements. And then, of course, all the environmental services to reach really reasonable prices. And we have it in several countries, especially when the fire cause was dealt with electricity companies and things like that. There are several processes in the court. One in Catalonia, the fire we saw from '94, is still under court. The Californian fire has been also electricity and has been is moving very fast in court. And there it's very important to have also really not ad hoc measurement, but quite a doctrine regarding what the real cost. And of course, if the issues are not private, but more of public nature, like environmental service, to have some forest fund that is able to capture these resources. Otherwise, they will just stay around. It is very important, this issue as well, to have that you don't need to discuss the basic methodologies, that they are set up, and then there is a way to also retain the environmental services if whoever is responsible is at the end condemned. So thanks a lot, Peter.
Eduardo, yes? I made the point that in India you've already got lots of solutions. If you look globally, like where Mark Castelnau is working, there's a lot of good material on those websites. So if you're looking for something, one of the roles that FAO can play, of course, is to put you in contact with people that can either have resources or have ideas. So please feel free to get in touch if you have fire questions.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Peter, for this presentation. Some important points for you. In India, you know, the forest fire management has been going on since ages. Okay, it was a traditional method of doing it. But with regard to the forest fire information network which we have created, it started way back in 2004, and now the information network is extremely good. So in near real-time basis, the information is given with lat long the area to all the foresters who are linked to the central database. And many of the young probationers, I've seen some of them are actually linked to the database, so they are also getting the information on their mobile. So the idea is that you take a quick decision and quick action, which was lacking earlier.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But after the 2016 fire in Uttarakhand, in the hill areas, the ministry was actually approached the World Bank, and the report which you've stated is I was also involved in preparation of that report. The report actually outlines a lot of activities, and as you rightly pointed out, the probationers should go through the report. It's very well documented, and all the do's and don'ts, everything is written out there, including, and the ministry has taken out a national action plan on forest fire monitoring and mitigation. So that's an important thing. Fire in India, 65% of forest areas are prone to fire, but the crown fire would be around 2.5%. It's mainly surface fires.
Yeah.
But then, obviously, with surface fire, there's a lot of emissions, which we have to look at it in a proper manner, particularly in context with our NDC target of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent,
Sure.
for which we're doing massive afforestation, but also we need to reduce the emissions from forest fire, which you've rightly pointed out. But all the states now are very much seized of the matter, and there is adequate funding also for firefighting in our country. What we always say that you should try and preempt that the fire doesn't take place. It's easier said than done. It's difficult because in India it's not 95, it's 98%, I would say 99%, which is man-made.
Which is people.
And it's difficult to control all the fires, but then if you have one, resources, number two, the will, and number three, the manpower, I'm sure you can at least preempt further destruction of areas. So we are into it. It's a very important aspect of management for us. And I think all the forest officers who are working in the field are absolutely geared up between these months of, from November, December till January, till June in our country, because it's quite a long fire season. And people are very active in the field to try and stop any of the forest fires.
Yep. Thank you.